Hello everyone, Miklos Vespremi here, coming to you from Olbia, Italy. In the last video we discussed what carbon credits were. I introduced you to what a carbon credit is, what types there were, and how they compared. Today I'd like to address what their role is in fighting climate change. And next week I'll share with you some thoughts on what current bottlenecks exist that are preventing the market from scaling. And now, as we get into quite technical details, I'd like to give one more disclaimer. The carbon credit market is changing extremely quickly. So as a result, what I talk about here is not out of date, but might be by latest early next year. So what I'm incorporating here is the information available as of the end of October 2023. So let's address the three key points that are plaguing the carbon credit market. First of all, that the carbon removal potential that they represent is a moral hazard. Secondly, that all that carbon credits achieve is juggling emissions around, and that juggling emissions around doesn't really achieve anything. And thirdly, that they are worse than useless, as evidenced by a consistent criticism at their methodology, voiced most prominently by The Guardian in January 2023. So let's tackle each one by one. Regarding the first, the idea is that as long as we think that there is a magic bullet for carbon credits that exists, but that just has not been discovered or scaled properly, there's no reason to continue to decarbonize operations today. And by the way, the same critique also applies to geoengineering. Since carbon credits create a market for carbon removal technologies, they can thus be seen as complicit in this challenge. The question, the moral hazard, the question of the moral hazard of carbon credits, of course, is enormous. But let me just share some preliminary thoughts here. Now, let me first start with a partial endorsement of the moral hazard critique. Now, many IPCC reports include negative emissions or carbon removal as the solution to mopping up the last few emissions after everything else has been tried. The concept first gained prominence in the fifth assessment report of 2014 at a point in which carbon removal technologies had a TRL or technological readiness level of around 4 of a total of 9. So the TRL is a qualitative scale to evaluate how far technology is from being able to be used in real life. Carbon removal was little more than research in 2014. And although it can be said to have just reached maturity, so TRL 9 today, it is nowhere as cost efficient as it needs to be to enable the scaling we truly need. So just to underline that, today the largest carbon removal plant in the world, the plant by Climeworks in Iceland, removes 4,000 tons of CO2 per year. That is equivalent to the annual emissions of 500 homes. So, in other words, utterly irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. It's simply a matter of thermodynamics that it is easier to release CO2 by burning it than capturing it. Seeing these numbers really gives credence to interpreting the role of carbon removal as wishful thinking coming from the very top, IPCC. But now let me just continue the qualification of this moral hazard critique. We will collectively have to fight against unimaginable odds to make this technology, so direct air capture, for example, anywhere near relevant. But on the other side, in the 1960s, solar power was so expensive that the only application that it could be defensively used for was spaceflight. Today it has become, of course, the cheapest source of energy in many places. And I do believe that we may get to the point at which such technologies as direct air capture become commercially viable. And in principle, it doesn't actually matter when it happens, but it does matter that it happens. Of course, it does matter when it happens, but just think, what if it were to become commercially viable in the 2070s? So removing CO2 for $1 a ton. And we drive our emissions down into the negative by the 2080s. We still will have an enormous problem, but getting the problem solved into the 2080s is still infinitely better than not managing at all. Because the climate is going to get a lot worse very soon, but a lot worse is far less worse than what it can get, since literally the limit is our planet becoming into Mars. Now, what about carbon capture and storage, or CCS? The challenge, of course, is related. It recently came to light that the world's largest CCS facility, the Century plant that a major oil company started using in 2018, made almost no impact and at no point was used for more than 10% of its capacity. Well, isn't that damning? Well, probably, but not necessarily. At some point, I will make a video about my thoughts on the role of oil and gas in the climate transition, but let me simply make a point related to direct air capture that CCS may still find successful, technically and commercially viable applications in the future, although the picture today, of course, looks pretty grim. So, in conclusion, the moral hazard is very real indeed. If these technologies, however, can be seen as complements rather than substitutes to carbon reduction efforts, the picture, I think, is a bit different. Nevertheless, we do need continued pressure from civil society and politics and climate activists on these players to step up their game immediately. We need to be reminded at how big the climate change crisis is and how desperate we are for a solution. We must continue to be incensed about broken and empty promises from companies and corporations. But I am against blanket condemnations against technologies that might one day be able to have a very real impact. Because black and white condemnation of any specific technology, at the end of the day, is just the other side of the coin of believing in magic bullets, which is what it's supposed to criticize. So let's go for an approach that tries out everything, because we do not know which technology really will work, not just in the lab, but also in its implementation and scaling. That brings us to the second criticism that I'd like to address. And that is that carbon credits achieve nothing but juggling emissions. And juggling emissions around does not do anything to lower them on absolute terms. And now, at face value, that is definitely true. However, if the time component is taken into account, I think that the picture again is a bit different. What carbon credits allow us to do is to take more ambitious climate action today by buying time. So, some climate strategies take a long time to implement, but will eventually lower the total emissions. Changing a business model or building major new infrastructure, for example, may imply substantially higher emissions in the very short term, but once it is completed, be far more effective overall and lower the total emissions over the entire lifetime. Now, if the entity that is doing that has committed or has been forced to lower its emissions, it can thus remain on target by, in effect, trading future reductions for the present through carbon credits. So, just to give an example, imagine an operator of an emissions-intense asset, say a machine to produce tires. No idea if that is very emissions-intense, but I'm just assuming this. Now, it is also committed to ambitiously decarbonize its operations. So it has two options. Firstly, this company could write off the machine and buy a new one that is environmentally friendlier and reduce its emissions immediately. But incur enormous costs for this cutting-edge technology, likely. Secondly, they could let the machine run until the end of its lifetime, offset the emissions in the meantime, and then buy some similar machine or something better in the future that may even come even cheaper because the technology that right now is pretty cutting edge then has already matured and maybe become commoditized. Now, let's just assume that carbon credits work properly and actually sequester the carbon they promise, which is, of course, a topic addressed in my previous video. In that case, option 2 might well be the cheaper one, making it also the one more likely to be implemented in the first place. Of course, I repeat, this only works if carbon offsets are doing what they promise to be doing. But exactly this logic explains why carbon offsets are or will become very attractive in sectors or activities that are hard to abate and more expensive to abate than simply buying carbon credits, because it is simply a question of economic efficiency. Finally, let's come to the last criticism, which is that carbon credits are worse than neutral. So on January 18, 2023, there was an explosive investigation published by The Guardian. It claimed that 94% of carbon credits had no benefit to the climate, and that the threat to force was overstated by 400%. This, of course, all applied to Vera, the largest issuer of carbon credits. And the argument went that by allowing companies to believe that their emissions were being sequestered efficiently, they may have been tempted, in fact, to pollute even more than otherwise, leading to a net increase in emissions overall. I just want to point out that long before this article appeared, The Guardian and scientists around the world had been pointing out problems in the system. 2 years earlier, for example, The Guardian wrote, and I quote, "Beyond that, there are concerns about the inherent problem of looking into the future and predicting which trees would and would not have been felled, and of proving additionality, that the project itself made a difference to the outcome, which have dogged the offset system from its outset." Pretty damning words, end quote. Sorry. So, just to say, the critique is definitely fair. In my previous video, I discussed the various types of credits and their shortcomings. And the question is whether the challenges of implementation in these various credits can be overcome, or whether the system itself is too complicated to enable an effective implementation at all, which is a very real problem. And just as an aside, a major criticism of communism is that it doesn't work. And what the communists would reply, in some cases, was that it was not implemented properly. But then you come up against human nature and the world as it stands today. If you cannot make something work in the world as it stands today and with human nature, well, maybe it is a problem of the design of the system itself. Side note, finished. So just to come back to this. So, of course, there are many much more relevant or effective systems of climate finance that might be able to make a much bigger effect. So take fossil fuel subsidies. If the several $1 trillion that are spent on fossil fuel subsidies were to subside all of a sudden, green technologies would be on an unimaginably more competitive footing compared to fossil fuels, and it would just make no sense to keep investing in fossil fuels anywhere ever again. Cutting those subsidies, however, is politically unfeasible in many systems as they stand today. Carbon credits are what the market economy understands and can deal with. If carbon credits can be improved to achieve what they are designed to do, I believe that they can begin to play a far more impactful role than they do today. But to hear more on that topic, join me next week for a discussion of the shortcomings in the carbon credit markets as they stand today. With that, I leave you until next Sunday. Again, critique is always very welcome. Looking forward to seeing you next week. Goodbye.